Hi guys, welcome to the second video in this section. As we said before, this section covers the 4 basic components of an online lesson plan. And today we're going to start with the first phase in the online lesson plan, which is the warm-up part. So in today's lecture, we're going to cover 3 basic points or 3 basic sections. The first section here, we're going to explain what are the 2 basic components in the warm-up phase of your lesson. And then for the second and third sections, we're going to go deeply into those 2 sections. So we're going to take each section independently and explain it more clearly, tell you how to implement it effectively in your online class, some tips and tricks, do's and don'ts to make sure it's done effectively in the best way possible, as well as some online tools that will help you in each phase. So without further ado, the warm-up phase is a very, very important part of your lesson plan. And I cannot stress this enough. It is crucial. That means you cannot neglect it, you cannot ignore it. And as teachers, what I found is that many online teachers neglect this part because we get short on time. We don't have enough time for the actual lesson. So we skip the warm-up phase and we directly go into the lesson itself. And this is very common, especially when we're all experimenting with new technology, us as well as the students. We're trying to figure out how to make the most of, let's say, 45 minutes or 50 minutes online. And we tend to skip the warm-up phase just to, directly start the lesson. And this is a big mistake because the warm-up phase is, let's say, the staging part of the lesson. So you have to prepare your students, and this is when you do that. This is when you tell the students what they're expected to learn, how they're going to learn, how this is going to be useful for them, how this skill is relevant to their own real-life experience, how this is something that would affect their examination maybe later on, how is this something that would help them outside school. What are they expected to learn? How are they expecting to do it? You get the mindset into actually achieving what they have to achieve. They know what they need to finish by the end of the session. And that is the part where you, as I told you, it's how you prepare them. This is the staging area. So you cannot, under any circumstances, skim it or neglect it. If you are running short on time, then what you can do is you can keep it to a minimum. Let's say 2 to 4 minutes maximum if you want to. So if you're short on time, you can make the warm-up phase extremely short, but you have to make sure that you have both important sections in it, which are the objectives and the lesson, what I like to call the lesson springboard. You have to include both in your 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and you'll find that it's not going to take more than that. But it's really important that you do not neglect either one of them. So the first part of your warm-up section is the part where you set your class objectives. And as teachers, we're all very familiar with this term. We know what objectives are. Objectives are basically the goals or the aims or what you want your students to be able to do by the end of this session, or what skills you want them to acquire. And while it may seem as something that is pretty straightforward and easy and something that we do on a daily basis, there are some things that we need to take into consideration into our lesson plans, especially if they are online. So let's first go into some basic tips and guidelines that we have to remember, or things that we have to include in our objectives. So first of all, quality is key. And again, I cannot stress this enough. As a teacher, it's not about how much or how many skills you teach them. It's about how well those skills are mastered. So always remember, go an inch wide and a mile deep. So if you teach them 2 to 3 skills, or even just 1 skill, and they have mastered it pretty well, that they don't need to go back to it later on, they have complete mastery of that skill, is much better than having, let's say, 3 or 4 objectives and just basically kind of, brushing over them or skimming over them. So your objectives, accordingly, your objectives are not supposed to be that many. So your objectives are going to be, let's say, 1 to 3 objectives maximum in order to ensure that. If you have more than 3, then it's not going to be realistic. It's not going to be met. What you can master in a 45-minute session or a 50-minute session or an hour session is usually I cover around 2 per lesson. Sometimes if your students are high achievers and you have a lot of time, or you can go through something quickly than you expected, it could be 3, but it's never going to be more than 3 if we want to be realistic. Now, another consideration that we need to take into our objectives is that it targets higher order thinking skills for our students. Now, as teachers, most of us are aware of Bloom's taxonomy, and we know that the thinking skills or learning skills of students go through 6 phases. And if we get stuck in the last 2 over here and here, then we are only targeting basic skills. We are not equipping them well enough to be critical thinkers. They do not have mastery of the critical thinking skills. And therefore, what we need to do is to try to target higher thinking skills, which are basically at the top of the pyramid over here. Now, I'm not saying that we should not include any of the low-level thinking skills. We should. But if your entire online lesson is focused on understanding, identifying, describing, explaining, listing, defining, then you are stuck once again in a low-level thinking skill or a low-level lesson, which means you don't challenge your students enough and you're not equipping them with the necessary critical thinking skills they need as critical thinkers. We're not equipping them with the skills that they need. We're not giving them mastery of it. So as teachers, we have to target the higher end of the spectrum over here. Okay, so let me give you a quick example. If I'm teaching my students as an English teacher, I'm an English teacher, so let's say I'm teaching them to write a personal narrative essay. Maybe one of my objectives could be identify the structure and purpose of a personal narrative essay. But if that's my whole lesson, then I'm stuck right here in the understanding part of the pyramid, which is a very low level of my lesson. However, as we said earlier, maybe my objectives could have 2 to 3. My lesson, could have 2 to 3 objectives. So maybe my first objective could be a lower level here, which is identifying the purpose and structure of a personal narrative essay. And then maybe my second objective could be analyze a sample personal narrative essay. It could be evaluate the effectiveness of a sample essay. It could be create your own introductions for a personal narrative essay. So now I know that I did tackle something that is a bit higher level thinking skill. So as teachers, if we find ourselves, we're always covering list, classify, describe, identify, explain, blah, blah, blah. We're always stuck at the very bottom. We're not giving our students the maximum skills that they can master, and we're not letting them reach their maximum potential. Now, the second thing we need to focus on is setting smart objectives. Ironically enough, as teachers, we teach our students that at the beginning of the year, we teach them to set their own objectives for what they need, for what they want to achieve by the end of the year. And we tell them to make sure their objectives are smart, but sometimes we forget to do that or neglect to do that in our own lesson plan objectives. So to basically go over them quickly, specific, which means basically do not leave it general or generic. Make it specific, a specific target that you want to achieve. So what do you want them to do? Going back to my previous example, if I'm teaching them to write a personal narrative essay, I'm not going to say write a personal narrative essay specifically. What do I want them to do this session? I want them just to write the introduction. So that's specific enough. Number 2, measurable. Can I check if I've reached this goal or not before the end of the session? So the answer here could be yes, because my students at the end of the session will submit or hand in introductions, or they will write their own introductions, and then I can see them and I can measure how well they achieved the target. Achievable. Can you achieve it by the end of the session? So be realistic. Don't set a goal that is not going to happen unless you're a super teacher. So for example, don't let the target be write a personal narrative essay. You have 45 minutes. How are your students, 30 students of them, going to write and submit and receive feedback on the whole essay? So you can also find sometimes it's called attainable, which is the same thing. Now, realistic. The R sometimes is also read as relevant, not just realistic. Realistic, as we said, something that is not too optimistic or also that expects the worst of your students. So don't make something that, don't suggest something or plan something that's going to be too difficult for your students, and don't also plan something that is too easy for your students, something that fits their level, something that they can do and finish and turn in and receive feedback within 45 minutes. And if we take this R as relevant, then this should be relevant to their overall, to the overall plan or strategy that you have for your students. So maybe relevant to the curriculum that they're covering, relevant to the national agenda that you're covering, relevant to the examinations that they're going to take later on, relevant to the let's say, long-term plan of every student. Maybe they need to be able to master writing essays by the end of high school. So that is relevant to their strategy or their plan, their long-term plan. Finally, timely. When do you want to achieve it? And usually by default, your objectives are already time-bound because you're expecting students to master this by the end of the session. Now, sometimes if you're teaching something over a number of sessions or a number of weeks, then you can say by the end of this week, students will be able to, by the end of this month, students will be able to, by the end of this session, and so on. Now let's take an example here. Which one of the following two objectives is a SMART objective? Okay, if you've guessed the second one, then you are right, but not because it's longer, because it actually has the 5 parts, the S, M, A, R, and T. Let's look at it more clearly. You will be able to write and proofread an informational text. By the end of the lesson, you will be able to write effective thesis statements for the informational text. So first of all, we have here the time bound by the end of the lesson. So here's my T. What about what are they going to be doing specifically? I have here the S, write effective thesis statements for informational texts. Here is my S. What about the M? How do you think I'm going to be able to measure if they wrote it? Well, we can guess that they're going to write thesis statements, and maybe I can give them a rubric or something, or give them guidelines, and then when I receive their thesis statements, I can measure whether or not they were written correctly. What about the A, achievable and attainable? Do you think 45-minute session will be enough to teach students how to write effective thesis statements? I think so. You have 45 minutes, so it is attainable. What about the R? Is it realistic? Is it relevant? Yes, it's relevant because students need to be able to write informational texts as part of the school strategy, so it is relevant to the overall strategy. And the T, as we mentioned earlier. However, if we take a look back at the previous example, it's not specific. Writing informational text, not telling me which part of the informational text. It does not give me a time limit. It's not realistic. How can I finish all of this in one session? So it's not realistic. It could be measurable maybe if they write and submit, okay? But it's not realistic and it's not achievable. Okay, now that we're done with the first part of the warm-up phase, we're ready to go to the second one, which is the lesson springboard. So once we have set the objectives and explain them to our students, discuss them with our students, told them what they need to achieve by the end of the lesson, we can go on to the lesson springboard. This is what I like to call it. And basically the lesson springboard is a few questions that you can start with your students as a warm-up. And that's why I don't like to call it warm-up questions, because it doesn't have to be a question, it could be an activity. It could be a picture that you discuss, it could be a video that you comment on, it could be an open-ended question, it could be a poll. It actually basically falls to you, and it depends on the topic that you need to cover, what best suits it, and what best accommodates your students' needs. So whatever your warm-up question is or your warm-up activity is, in order to make it effective, you have to make sure that you meet 5 basic conditions. So the first thing, what's the objective of your warm-up question? Well, your warm-up question is there to do one of 2 things. Either to go back to a previous point and expand on it, so you want to remind students of some prior knowledge and you want to assess how well they remember it or know it, or you want to lead up to a topic that you're going to cover in the lesson. So for example, maybe I studied with my students in English, we covered as one of our selections, we read a personal narrative, and now I'm going to teach them how to write a personal narrative essay. So I could ask them a question about why do people write personal narrative essays, maybe, or what goes into the structure of a personal narrative essay, or what topics could a personal narrative essay talk about. I'm assessing what they already know, and I'm leading up to the writing of a personal narrative essay. Now, sometimes you can't do both. Sometimes you're either recapping something or you're leading up to something, that's fine. But at least make sure there's a clear goal in your warm-up. The second thing, as we mentioned earlier, higher order thinking skills. I'm going back to Bloom's taxonomy. Go for challenging questions. Go for questions that ask students to argue, to defend, to support, to differentiate, okay, instead of identifying. And when you're asking them questions, don't ask them yes or no questions. Yes or no questions are a no-no. Why? Because you want to make your question open-ended. You want to make it thought-provoking. You want to make the question a question that could start up a discussion. The question that could get students to start thinking and imagining and thinking of creative solutions and solving problems. Not one that is short and quick and will not give them room to express themselves and give their opinions. So don't tell them, for example, are personal narrative essays fiction or non-fiction? That is a short question. You could go for open-ended, something like WH questions. Why? Give your opinion on, explain, expand, describe, okay? And this also ensures that you can do the next part, which is give equal opportunities for all students. If you ask them a yes or no question, then when one student answers you, it's done for. Nobody needs to answer anything else. But when you have an open-ended question, students could have different answers and different responses and different opinions to the same question. So why do you think learning personal narratives is important? In what situation in real life will you need to write a personal narrative? This is something a bit more challenging for them and could have multiple answers. And later on, I can tell you examples of a few portals that you can use to do that. But when you're doing it if you're doing it in class, it could be as simple as posting a question on the board and giving them a sticky note, and they could write their answers, collect them, and then get 2 to 3 students to answer. If you're doing it online, you can simply write the question and then students can respond. And I will tell you more about those tools in a bit. So let's take it one by one. The last most important thing is linking the lesson to real life. Why is this important? I found this to be very engaging for my students because they get to know what's in it for me. Now, this is a concept lots of students experiment with, especially teenagers and high schoolers. Whenever you teach them something, if you don't explain to them why this is useful for them, why this benefits them, then they're not motivated enough to learn it. But when you link it to real life, you can kind of connect it to their everyday life outside of school, and then they can learn why they're wasting their time on this. Why are they spending so much time and effort on it? So a question like, in what situation in real life would you write a personal narrative? Why is acquiring this skill useful to you as a college student? And so on. For example, here's a quick example of 2 warm-up questions depending on the lesson. So let's say I am teaching my students to write a compare and contrast essay. My question could start with, why do you need comparing and contrasting skills in real life? There is a clear real-life connection over here. It's an open-ended question. It requires them to analyze and relate, which is something higher in the Bloom's taxonomy. And it serves as a springboard for the comparing and contrasting essay writing that they're going to do. Another example here is if I'm teaching, let's say, types of irony in a literature session. I could start with a question like, why do people use sarcasm during their speech? Again, there's a real-life connection. It's an open-ended question, could have more than one answer, and it targets higher level thinking skills. Now, this is all great in theory and maybe in traditional classes, but how do I make sure that this happens online? How can I share my objectives and share my springboard questions with my students during an online lesson? Well, you're going to find that I have 2 sections for you here. One is for basics. That means if you're not very tech savvy and you don't like to experiment with new tools, or you're a bit nervous to try out new tools, even though I do not encourage that. I go for creativity in classes because this is what keeps students engaged. But if you are not quite sure about that, you can just go back to the basics, which is let's say you are teaching them in a class on Zoom or on Teams or whatever. You can write the objectives. Basically, you can share your screen and write the objectives on a Word document. You can write the objectives on PowerPoint slides, Google slides, and just basically what you do here is you share your screen with your students. But what is vital here that your students must see the objectives. So don't just say them. Now, why that is important is because many of your students are visual. So this way you make sure that you appeal to them as well. So if they're not auditory, they're going to tune out if they just hear the objectives. But when they see it in front of them, they can actually pay more attention to it. So go back to the basics, write your objectives in a Word document, PowerPoint slide, Google slide, and then share your screen with your students and discuss it with them. There's also another option if you're teaching on Teams or Zoom. If you're a school teacher, you're usually most probably using one of those 2. There's something called the interactive whiteboard, which is basically an option. You just click on it in the call, it displays a whiteboard. Take your pen, the stylus pen on the screen, and start explaining. Now, if you want to get a bit more creative, or you want to make it a bit more fun, which is something I am a huge supporter of, is you can start experimenting with new websites that you can use to display the objectives. One of those websites is Nearpod, and this is one of my favorite websites. Oops, sorry. Crossed it out here. Now, Nearpod is a website that enables you to create interactive PowerPoints. So you don't just post your information, you can actually embed questions and you can embed activities and so on, so your students interact more with it. We're going to go more into detail on that later on in the presentation part of the lesson, and I'm going to attach some links to videos to help you experiment with Nearpod. Prezi is also another website that you can use to portray PowerPoint in a more creative way. Slidesgo.com is the website I used to create this PowerPoint. It's basically it's an amazing website. You just log in, you choose whatever template that you want, and you download as a PowerPoint template, and you just edit it. And it gives you lots of creative, amazing templates. And emaze.com is actually the website I used for the previous lecture on the 4 parts of a lesson plan. It is an amazing website as well that enables you to create 3D PowerPoints. However, the only drawback to that is that it allows you to create only 5 for free, and then you have to pay for any additional PowerPoints that you create. Now, for your lesson springboard or for your warm-up question, again, if we go to the basics, you can do the same thing right here. You can share your screen and write on it the warm-up question on a Word document, PowerPoint slide, Google Slides, on the interactive whiteboard. And what you can also do is, if you're teaching on Teams or Zoom, you can just type the question in the meeting chat and then students can type back in response. This also encourages interactivity. You can post it on your students' learning platforms such as Edmodo, and students can comment. You can write a post on Teams and students can comment on it, and then you can like or comment back. If you don't want to go to the basics and you want to add some interactivity to it, again, you can use the same website I mentioned before, which is Nearpod. And this is basically for the whole lesson. But for the warm-up phase, or for the warm-up questions, the springboards, those two websites are highly specific for the springboard part, or for the warm-up questions. And what you do here is you post the question and the students can respond to the questions in real time, and you can display that screen and share it with your students. So basically, Padlet is like colorful sticky notes. They choose the color of the sticky notes, they respond. You basically it's very easy to use. You just write the question, choose a background, and then share the link with the students. They just enter, choose the color of their sticky notes, respond. They can even attach links to their answers, pictures to their answers, and so on. And Mentimeter is the same idea, but it's just a bit more basic. Now, again, the drawback to Padlet here is it allows you only 3 Padlets for free, and then you can buy it. But you can always delete and create new ones for those 3 if you want. And you can always do what I do, which is use a number of emails to sign in for more than one account and create Padlets for free on it. So that's basically the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for watching. Just please, before you end this lecture or end the video, take a moment to reflect on what you learned today. You can answer those 2 questions on a sticky note or on your laptop, or even out loud to yourself, or even mentally if you like. Just make sure that you remember what we covered today. So the 2 key learnings are: what are the 2 components of the warm-up phase of the lesson, and how can we ensure that they're both effective, or that the warm-up phase of the lesson is effective. Thank you so much, guys. See you next session.